we have to talk about lax vowels. So the bottom line up front is that the pronunciation of Latin as normally taught is wrong. Specifically, the sounds I and U, which are called lax vowels, are wrong in Latin. How can this be? Why is this matter? So if you've been following my content for a while, I've spoken about this on several occasions, but I've never really gone into a great deal of depth with respect to the authors, the philologists that actually talk about this, the arguments for and against, and really analyzed what's going on. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at segments from Allen, from Adams, and from Calabrese. The argument from Allen that I intend to refute today is that the qualities of short letter I and short letter U must be I and U. So let's see what Allen has to say about that. Now, I intend to present this argument as clearly and as correctly as possible. I don't want to create a straw man. I want to really try to prove this argument correct before I look at evidence that contradicts this hypothesis of Allen's. So the first thing that he mentions, which is absolutely correct and very important, is that the main difference in Latin vowels, in fact, the most important part of it, in my opinion, the most important part of the grammar, literature, the phonology, is the difference between long and short phonemic vowels. And the way I pronounce them, a, e, I, o, u. Those long and short variants. And not only is this important to classical Latin pronunciation, but any Latin we deal with, especially classical Latin, we can use ecclesiastical pronunciation. That's fine. I have no problem with that. But the most important thing, of course, is this contrast between phonemic long and short vowels must be there if we are dealing with that kind of literature. Otherwise, we're missing half the story practically. So he talks about the main difference being long and short vowels, of course. As is commonly the case, the long vowel subsystem occupies a larger periphery of articulation than the short. The short vowels being in general more laxly articulated, so lax vowels, and so less far removed than the corresponding long vowels from the neutral position of the speech organs. Okay, and then so here's his model. The long vowels a, same quality as a, he says, and this is e, and this is I, U, O, but this is, according to him, A, E, O, I, U. Now, he doesn't use the IPA characters here, but this is demonstrated elsewhere. He says the relative height or closeness of the long and short I and U can be estimated with fair accuracy. In the later development of Latin, the diphthong I changed to a new long mid-vowel more open than the long E, which we may symbolize as E. I don't know why he doesn't just use IPA, but that's what we see a lot of philologists do for some reason. Anyway, he talks about those contrasts. The point here that he makes, which is convincing, is that we have classical vivere, to live, and Italian vivere. And the classical pira, pears, turns into Italian pera. And this merges with the classical long e. The short I merges with long e, verum, becoming Italian vero, as he writes here. Classical mel becomes Italian miele. Classical caelum becomes Italian gelo. But notice that the a, no quality change. Mare, carum, mare, and caro in Italian. So we have a demonstrable change in romance, he says romance, which is very interesting, we'll get to this. And the long I and U throughout remain distinct from the other vowels. Thus, for late Latin at least, short I and U will have been nearer in quality to long E and O than to long I and U, and long E and O nearer in quality to short I and U than short E and O. This hypothesis is in fact supported by the statements of some of the grammarians. An acoustic difference between long and short I is clearly observed by Velleius Longus and by Consentius. By then he was, of course, called Consentius. And in the statement attributed to Terentianus Maurus, we find quotienscumque e longam volumus proferri, vici nascit ad I litteram. We find a reference to the pronunciation of long O as having a greater degree of lip rounding. Now, before we go on, I have something very important, and I made this document for myself. This is publicly available on lucranieri.com, of a timeline of all of the Latin authors, because when they wrote is important. So when did these folks live? Well, Consentius, here he is, 5th century, 400s. Also Pompeius. And those are the two that we were just looking at. So 5th century. The Roman Empire, as we think of it, is about to fall. This is hundreds of years after classical Latin. That doesn't mean what they have to say isn't valuable. It is. It's very, very important to consider. But it doesn't mean that the system that is being described here is necessarily the system of classical Latin. Now, why is that relevant? It's relevant because people reconstruct the restored pronunciation of classical Latin is meant to be the pronunciation as close as we can get to Cicero and Caesar, to Virgil, to Augustus, through Petronius, Tacitus, Apuleius. And we want to get into the classical Latin pronunciation. So when we're using sources, when Allen, who frequently does this, which I find interesting, he frequently uses sources that are hundreds of years later or before, which is very interesting, in order to justify some of his conclusions. Now, that's not uncalled for, but it is something that I think we should be cautious about when hundreds of years can make quite a big difference. So the qualitative similarity of short e and long e is also illustrated from early times by the tendency of inscriptions to write letter e for short letter I and letter I for long letter e. For example, trebibos, menus, mensis for tribibus minus mensis. And by the frequent use of the Greek epsilon to render Latin short letter I. So lepedos for lepidus, kometion for comitium, dometios for domitius, tiberios for tiberius. The similarity of short u and long o is likewise illustrated by inscriptions columnas sub octubris punere for columnas sub octobris ponere. And of course he mentions that Greek omicron for Latin short u cannot be used as evidence, since Greek in any case had no short u sound. Well, of course, depends on the dialect and the time, but certainly any Greek that's going to interact with Latin very unlikely to have a short u sound natively. So here's the argument so far. We have Romance languages which demonstrate a significant quality change for short e and short u into e and o. And we also have inscriptional evidence demonstrating that this might have been happening, or in fact, according to Allen, it absolutely was already happening as a confusion back in antiquity. In fact, well, it doesn't say. He then says that this applies to classical Latin, but exactly when these are from, is this during the classical Latin period? That's part of the issue. His conclusion, therefore, is that short e and u had much the same value as the corresponding vowels in pit and put. And short e and o were similar to the vowels pet and it'd be British pot. It's not my American pot, so pot and pit. Pit, put, I, u, e, o. So that's Allen's argument, that the Romance languages have a change with short i and u, and there is inscriptional evidence to show that there was a vowel confusion in antiquity. Now, a moment ago, Allen was using grammarians from very late, from the end of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, to justify some of the things that he intended. Well, if we're going to do that, we might actually read precisely what they say. So Pompeius says, a, I, u similiter habent sive longae, sive breves. The vowel letters a, I, u, they have the same quality, whether long or short. And here's this important term. There's quantity and quality, and these terms are important. We use in colloquial language, quality versus quantity. In linguistics, we're talking about the actual duration of phonemes, in this case, vowels. So a long vowel has greater quantity, and a short vowel has less quantity. So those are quantitative differences in vowels, vowel length differences, phonemic vowel length. And quality means exactly what kind of vowel it is, where on the chart. So if we go back up to his chart here, there basically are 5 qualities, at least on the outside, represented, right? So a, e, I, u, o. So those are qualities. And he's saying that at least 4 of the short ones have different qualities. as well as having different lengths. So I but I, U but U, E but E, U but O. Now, this is taken from the Roman pronunciation of Latin by Francis E. Lord in the 1890s when he put this together. And he cites also from Pompeius saying that E aliter longa aliter brevi sonat. The vowel letter E sounds different when it's long or it's short. So the durations are not in question, but their quality is something interesting. He says that it gets similar to the letter I to E, which is what Alan quoted a moment ago. Quando dicis evitat, vicina debet esse, sic pressa, sic angusta, ut vicina sit ad I littera. Obviously, by the way, I'm not going to try to do a reconstructed pronunciation of Latin for the 5th century because that's just not easy for me to do on the fly. So I'm using classical Latin pronunciation for now. So evitat, not evitat, is essentially the idea here. And I agree with that. He says the same thing about orator, that it should be a closed O sound, but obit should be an open one. And Robert Wright actually interprets this differently as wo already in the 5th century, which is very interesting, but it's really not that critical because I'm not disputing this for a late Latin pronunciation. Let's go to good old Keil, old Heinrich Keil, so Henricus Caelius, who in the 1860s put together all these Latin grammarians in this wonderful text, which is very useful. Here is Consentius, or Consentius, as they call themselves, most definitely. So let's look a little bit more about what at least late grammarians say on the topic, because they also talk about ioticism. Iotacismum dicunt vitium, quod per illiteram, vel pinguius vel exilius pro latam fit. So ioticism is when the letter I is either too fat or too thin. That's essentially the meaning of this terminology. Exilis has a sense of thinness, and pinguis has a sense of fatness. That is what they mean. Galli pinguius hanc utuntur, hanc not hac, interesting, ut cum dicunt ite, non expresse ipsam proferentes, sed inter e et I pinguiorem sonum nescio quem ponentes. So he's saying the people of France, Latin speakers in France, they say something weird. It's a barbarism of some kind, and they, instead of saying ite, it's between letter E and I. They say ite, ite, or ite. I'm not exactly sure what that could be. Obviously, it has nothing to do with modern French. Graeci exilius hanc proferunt. Adeo expressioni eius tenui studentes ut si dicant ius aliquantulum de priori littera sic proferant, ut videas dissyllabum esse factum. So the Greeks, what they do is they turn a word like ius with an initial y sound into ius, which makes sense. Ancient Greek didn't have the sound of the consonant y, certainly not in the classical period, and obviously not by the 5th century AD. That is a part of modern Greek pronunciation, but the Greeks that were speaking Latin around this author still had something that was similar to classical Attic or Koine. So the problem is that they would say ius instead of ius. Romanae linguae inocerit moderatio, ut exilis eus sonus sit, ubi ab ea verbo incipit, udite, aut pinguior, ubi in ea desinit verbum, ut habui tenui. So he's saying that in the proper Roman speech, it should sound exilis in something like ite. Exilis is usually associated with short vowels, so I find it strange that ite would be associated with shortness. Otherwise, he's clearly talking about quality. And he's saying that the endings of, say, habui and tenui, they sound pinguior. Well, pinguior is something that's between the e and e, at least that's how he's using it up here. Now, how he's using it here could be a completely different way to describe it. It sounds thick somehow, pinguis. What does that mean exactly? Maybe the u is influencing the e, so not habui, but habui, or something like that, tenui. Medium quendam sonum inter e et I habet, ubi in medio sermone est, ut hominem. So evidently, in a word like hominem, it becomes homene. Mihi tamen videtur quando producta est plenior vel acutior esse, quando autem brevis est medium sonum exhibere debet, sicut eadam exempla, quae posita sunt declarare. Unfortunately, like most grammarians, he doesn't go into nearly enough detail, whether expressively and certainly not with enough examples. But if we take him at his word here, he's saying that when it's a short letter E, it has a sound that's between E and E. So E, which makes sense. And this is the 5th century AD, so this is all right in line with the transformations that we expect. Let's look at another primary source. So this is Velius Longus. When was Velius Longus? That's what this chart is for. So Velius Longus is the 2nd century. Now this is interesting. We consider classical Latin arbitrarily to end right about here. And so this might pertain a little bit more accurately to any kind of sound system that we might want to reconstruct. So he says, I vero litera intertum exilis est intertum pinguis, ut in eo quod est prodit, vincit, condit, exilius volo sonare. So I want to sound more exilis. In eo vero quod significator prodire, vincire, condire, aeque usque pinguescit. So here we have a pretty significant problem. From 300 years earlier, a grammarian is talking about the same kind of thing, the difference of quality of the letter I, depending on its length. And he says that exilis is the sound that we get in prodit, vincit, condit. However, in the previous document, just to show you, again, he says that quando producta est, that means long, quando producta est plenior vel acutior esse, quando autem brevis est medium sonum exhibere debet. So he seems to associate, this author, this is Consentius, is associating long vowels with exilis and pinguis with something else. This is just to demonstrate that relying on terminology like pinguis or exilis to actually tell us something useful is not necessarily the way to go, that we have to really try to interpret what they're saying. Especially like Pompeius, for example, apparently that's just the dictation of someone writing down the stuff he was saying to a class. So it's very difficult to follow sometimes. In any case, he is saying that the verb endings, this is very interesting because we're going to see this a moment in Adams. The verb endings for prodit, vincit, condit, they sound exilius, whereas prodire, vincire, condire, they pinguescunt, that they become fat. Well, here it sounds pretty clear that at least Velius Longus is using these terms of pinguis to mean at least length related, and that exilis is clearly associated with these short vowels. He notes also that the antiqui, so let's say pre-classical Latin writers and scribes would confuse u and o, but that's not part of how he speaks. That's very interesting. That they would, apparently these ancient Latins, they were confusing the o and the u. He also mentions the sonus medius, some kind of sound between u and e, optimus, maximus, or should it be optimus maximus? Apparently the spelling change was introduced by Caesar in his grammar book, and then it ended up through his influence becoming the way that we still spell Latin in the standard way, so optimus and maximus. But probably due to the M, this sound became somewhat rounded, so optimus maximus, something like an U sound, optimus maximus. That's the sonus medius. We're not going to really deal with it today because it doesn't really pertain that much to the argument. Now here's something else that's important to talk about. Quintilian, my favorite grammarian, 1st century AD. Yeah, where's he on the chart? Where's Quintilian? There's my guy. All right, 1st century, Quintilian, yeah. So this is going to give us this guy's going to give some really clear documentation on the sound of things. And something that's very interesting, that's not how we normally spell Latin, is he says that yesterday, here, spelled like this. Neque, and so it talks about the final letter E sound, that neque e plane, neque e auditur. So what he's describing here is this final sound, this E sound. So he's describing the sound of E. And he mentions elsewhere that here used to end heri. And he finds this kind of strange in the 1st century AD because everybody says heri, some kind of E sound, heri. And he says he identifies it as between E and E. Now, where on the chart could that be? It's not entirely clear. However, if we assume that the regular short letter E sound is here, even the long one, it could be E, and of course E somewhere up here. Well, what's between that? this is between that. It doesn't have to be I, here. It could be, but the simpler explanation is that it would stay on the front axis and be heri, heri. And you notice that Emperor Augustus actually would apparently write, I guess, heri, but then he would correct it to heri with the letter E. Very interesting that we don't have this. Now he also mentions that some writers would apparently write sibe and quase. And that's a really peculiar thing as well, that Livy would do this. So I wanted to show you some of these primary sources before we get into J.N. Adams, Social Variation, and the Latin Language. Now this is the really good stuff. We're in for a fun trip here. The comments, statistics, and conclusions of J.N. Adams in Social Variation and the Latin Language from just a few years ago, 2013. So it talks about the vowel system, vocalic misspellings and their interpretation. Vocalic misspellings or spelling variations occur throughout Latin. Some imperial spellings can be traced back into the Republic, and by definition, these cannot securely be used to argue for developments in the imperial vowel system, which means they also can't apply to the Romance developments either. A misspelling possibly reflecting, say, a vowel merger that shows up in Romance could, in a late Latin text, have a more mundane explanation. It might, for example, be old and archaizing and unrelated to recent developments. Worse, it might be open to more than one explanation. Though old, it might have been adopted by some writers in the imperial period not simply as an archaism, but because it happened to represent a current pronunciation. Mere statistics showing the incidence of a misspelling cannot be accepted on their own as evidence for a vowel change. Very interesting. So, thinking again, what is the argument of Allen? We see early inscriptional things which seem to anticipate the Romance developments, as well as some misspellings in the imperial period. We also have the Romance languages, and the third part of Allen's hypothesis, his argument, his vowel system, is that these reduced qualities happen in languages that have phonemic vowel length. So those are his arguments. Several books that present statistics from inscriptions seemingly showing the state of the vowel system have less value than might be thought, because alternative explanations of the misspellings have not been taken into account. So this is what we'll get into. Can we actually trust these misspellings, and what can they mean? Have they been cherry-picked by certain authors? So here is the exact reproduction of the Allen vowel system from Vox Latina, 1978. And he says, Allen remarks that in the case of the close I-U and the mid-E-O vowels, the long vowels seem to have been closer than the corresponding short vowels. Some evidence is cited to support this contention, which need not be repeated. There is also evidence that in languages with a length distinction, short vowels are more centralized, and that further favors the diagram presented by Allen. So this is very interesting and important to my argument here. J.N. Adams is not trying to disprove Allen. He is going over a lot of evidence that Allen himself has used, primarily just looking at the statistical evidence to see if it's even valid in of itself. He's not challenging the diagram by Allen. If anything, J.N. Adams is trying to challenge the idea that there existed some kind of substrate or some kind of vulgar Latin vowel system that was already like the Romance languages, or that vowel quantity was gone before the quality changes occurred. Now that's all so nonsensical that I'm not needing to deal with it, because we should all accept that proper, not just proper Latin, but all just native natural Latin in the classical period has what we would consider to be the correct phonemic vowel length distinctions. So we're taking that for granted, and I'm utilizing this evidence where he's talking about just looking at the data to put forth a different argument, that to say, in fact, no, thanks to J.N. Adams' work here, that the diagram by Allen, in fact, is not at all supported. So let's see that in more detail. He presents, again, this vowel chart. This is something like what Allen has. Very, very irritating. very irritating that philologists don't like to use the IP vowel chart, because that's actually how you should do it, especially because it's not actually symmetrical, and that's very interesting. The front axis and the back axis, they have correspondences, but they're not truly symmetrical in the actual mouth shape, much less the articulation. So that is very interesting. I think it's worth keeping in mind. So this is a gross simplification, and it uses these non-standard phonetic symbols. But this is essentially what is intended. I, U, E, O, E, O, A. So we see those I, U, E, O, E, O. And then this is the A down here. Not this one, it's this one. But there are regional variations in Romance. Sardinia merged each of the classical long-short pairs, A, E. A 5-vowel system is the result, not 7, like say Italian has. There it is. Balkan Romance, so Romanian, also Aromanian, combines features of the main Romance system of the Sardinian system. The front vowel axis has the same mergers that occurred in most Romance languages, like say Italian and French and Spanish. On the back vowel axis, long and short O and long short U, or U, merged, as in Sardinian, meaning that Romanian has the same kind of back axis as Classical Latin, or indeed the qualities that I give them for Classical Latin. That is to say, U short, U long, O short, O long. That is how they merge. Short U in Romanian did not become O. The Balkan and Sardinian systems are also found in residual dialect areas of southern Italy. We even note that developments are not so clear in the unstressed vowels. In these, the loss of the length distinctions happened before it did in the stressed vowels, and the confusion of vowel quality then went further than it did in the stressed vowels. Another note about Sardinian and other areas, that is, other than Sardinia, there have been mergers between vowels that were different with regard both to quality and to quantity in the classical system. That is, between E and A. On the other hand, there are qualitative distinctions between vowels that were originally distinguished by quantity, E and E. In these areas, changes of vowel quality must, of course, have taken place. Further, these changes ought to have preceded the loss of quantity. This is more evidence demonstrating that Latin must have had phonemic vowel length, at least, as we'll see, until the 3rd century without problems occurring to it yet. By the way, the links to Amazon to get these books are in the description. So let's talk about Republican and Imperial Latin. So much of the work on changes in Latin vowel system has been devoted to finding signs of the vowel mergers noted above as occurring in most of the Romance languages, notably that of E and E. There is a widespread view that the corresponding back vowel merger occurred later. I do, of course, agree with this. Inverse spellings, that is, E written for E and U for O, are far less easy to interpret, and perhaps should not be used to argue that a vowel change of Proto-Romance type is in evidence. There are many reasons why E might have been written for E. The difficulty of interpretation comes up in the Republican period, when early inscriptions not infrequently have E where E is expected. So let's talk about those. The vowel confusions in early Latin. Aidiles instead of aidilis. Of course, in Classical Latin it has the letter E. Aidiles. Tempestatibus. Trebibus. Semul. Soledas. Opedis. Dedet. Mereto. Minerva. Liber. Magister. So these are early Latin. These are not Classical Latin. So what are these actually representing? Now, the first is that these are extremely rare. And compared to all the other misspellings or non-standard spellings, these don't have a significant impact, as J.N. Adams will demonstrate here. For example, aidiles, aidilis, sic hec, fuet, capit, dedet, and so forth, these different misspellings. The Classical Latin vowel system had not fully developed yet, specifically one in which the O closes to U and the E closes to E. So when we encounter these in pre-classical Latin, we have to say, as is noted here, that this could be actually dialectical difference Another explanation is that the vowel change as it's going on in Old Latin, as we see e close to e and o close to u, scribes trying to write in the correct way may use older spellings or use an e where there never was one etymologically, just because the letter that we see as letter e, as e, was associated with two sounds. This ends up explaining quite a lot. The alternative is that the two vowels were articulated closely together, as is argued here. General instability of e and e. Now, that general instability makes a lot more sense. A general instability that could be real, or it could be because e and o in certain positions were closing to e and u, and therefore scribes were simply not sure which one to use and would use a fake archaic spelling. That could definitely explain a lot of the ones that we just looked at, although not necessarily, because look, now we have lepedos for lepidus, and this suggests that Latin e was a peculiarly open one, and that's what, of course, Alan says, and we saw that a moment ago. Okay, the above misspellings are found in stressed syllables, trebibos, semol, falesque, magister, hec, leber, and unstressed syllables after the accent, tempestatibus, soledas, opedis, merito, and before the accent, menerva, and in final syllables. The position of the vowel in the word and in relation to the accent is not a determinant of the confusion in early Latin, in pre-classical Latin. And, there's a little bit of a spoiler, this is a phenomenon which occurs in early Latin, and we don't actually see it again for many, many centuries later, and not during the classical Latin period. And that's what's so critical. So let me comment briefly on this Greek thing, so lepedos. And let's look at some IPA charts without covering my face. Okay, here we are. So here's, of course, the IPA vowel chart. Now, here is the vowel space of French, a little bit complicated. We have, of course, these nasal vowels like and all and so forth. So, and all. So we're going to we can kind of ignore those for the moment, as interesting as they are. Let's note that there is an E, there's E, there's E, just like Italian has, but there's also U and Ö on the front axis. That's interesting. Now here's the Italian vowel space. We have E and A and E, right? So those are all the same. And here's the modern Greek vowel space, which only has 5 phonemic vowels. Italian has 7, French has a lot more. And it has this, in particular, it has up here in the close front section of the chart, it has this U. It has another phonemic vowel that's real close to the A and the E. Now, the result of that seems to be that the French normally, this is mostly anecdotal, when the French speak English or Italian, their E sound tends to be quite a bit higher, quite a bit more close sounding than in Italian or English. So instead of being E, it's even more E. So, for example, to use the English word dear, they might say dear, very E, higher than it is in English. And if it were the Italian word dire, to say, they might say dire, dire, and it's even more close sounding, almost impossibly. And it's a very important characteristic of the sound of French. Now take the modern Greek speaker, native speaker, who then speaks, say, Italian. Well, normally they will pronounce the E sound of something like Italian, like it could be dire or whatever, or even in other positions, and it will sound significantly lower. Now, why is this occurring? Italian has 3 vowels on the front axis, and Greek only has 2. That means for a phonemic contrast to exist in Greek, and you can hear this if you listen to modern Greek, the E doesn't necessarily sound like it does in Italian. It sounds lower. It can sound more like E sounding. So that can happen in Greek accents in Italian, and also the opposite. Greeks often, when hearing Italians speaking modern Greek, will say that, yeah, your E sound is too high. It's too much as Italians can hear French having their E sound too high. Because if they're using their native E sound, it's going to sound, well, obviously a little bit different. I mean, it's different in different dialects of English, for example. And that's fascinating. Now, let's compare this to the ancient system. What's going on with that? Well, ancient Greek, depending on the century, but if we're talking about the beginning of the Alexandrine time, when we're getting these inscriptions like lepedos, what do we actually have in Greek? Well, Greek had a short e and a short o, right, on the two sides here. But it had a long E, represented by epsilon iota, and a long E, represented by the eta vowel, right? So it had something, in the long at least, it had the equivalent of the Italian vowel space. While the Latin qualities, let's assume the long and shorts were essentially just E and E. And we'll just say true mid E, something like modern Greek today. So this is probably the exact inverse of what's happening, where Greeks are hearing Latin speakers say lepidos, E. It's an E sound, lepidos, but it's lower than they're used to hearing for their iota, which gets pushed up to be more E sounding. So when they hear it, they're like, that sounds like lepidos for them. So Latin, lepidus, Greek, lepidos. And especially with a word that is articulated so quickly, those kind of confusions could make sense, especially when this is the kind of vowel space that we're definitely dealing with. It's certainly for the Greek side. Now, Alad would like us to think that there's a lot more complexity going on, but that's not the simplest explanation. Okay, let me get this vowel chart back down here. All right, that'll do. So that could explain all of the Greek ones, especially on the front axis. And why would it not happen as much on the back axis? Well, the Greek had the long u and o, but the u, which used to be the short u, was already going forward. And because of that fronting, the back axis will have more space, and the confusions between the two languages are going to be fewer. So the above misspellings are found in stressed syllables, trebibos, semol, falesque, magester, hec, leber. In unstressed syllables after the accent, tempestatebus, soledas, opedis, merito, and before the accent, menerva, and in final syllables. The position of the vowel in the word and in relation to the accent is not a determinant of the confusion. And this is what's going on in early Latin. So we can have a few things going on. Indeed, it could be that the early Latin short E was in fact significantly lower. It could be that these are spelling confusions caused by, once we have that vowel shift in Old Latin where many E become E. For example, it was something more like lingua before it became lingua. It's very interesting that we have a kind of Old Latin lingua, which goes into lingua. And then because of the vowel shifts that do happen in Romance, it was lingua, but then in Italian it goes back to lingua. And also think the ancient Greek en, meaning in. En is the etymological Proto-Indo-European one. In Latin, that shifts from en to in, and then shifts back to en in Romance, like Spanish and Proto-Italian. Spanish keeps en, but Italian raises it again to in for a different reason. It's fascinating how these things can, in fact, go back and forth in very specific ways. So it's important not to generalize, as Adams here reminds us, to generalize an antique phenomenon as something that would explain, say, the Romance developments. Some of these forms are special cases, and that's very important for Adams. In the perfect verb endings, the e was the early in the perfect. So deded for he or she gave. So dedit in classical Latin, deded. And the spelling et was very persistent even into the imperial period. Some other cases of the e spelling is also old. Going back, for example, to the time before vowel weakening had occurred. Merito. Or soledad. So this is very critical. So the whole vowel weakening that is what allows the Romance developments to happen, meaning, of course, the Western Romance, including Italian and excluding Sardinian. These all predate them, and they're in all the syllables. So the point is that he's making is it's simply not the same phenomenon. But there remain some cases where the e must represent a passing stage in the articulation of original short I. And that's the argument that I'm making, that many of these can be explained by the confusion as the vowel shift is occurring, or already has occurred, that the letter E, so that e vowel could represent the E sound, as it did in, say, the is ending of omnis. Omnis would have preceded that in the Old Lat and then became omnis, so this letter e can represent E. So this is how these confusions happen. The question arises whether such spellings reflect the same phenomenon as that seen in imperial inscriptions in the forms such as tetolo for titulum. Now this is absolutely the Proto-Romance thing, tetolo. That's exactly what that is. The last would traditionally be taken to show Proto-Romance developments, the versions of e and I, o and u. Allen interprets the form trebibos as showing the qualitative similarity of e and I in Republican Latin. In one sense or another, he must be right. If I was particularly open, it might have been articulated anywhere along the I-E axis, as it appears in Allen's diagram set above. Perhaps it was not far removed from e itself, or alternatively, the view, it seems, of Allen, it might have been articulated close to e. So this is another problem I have with the choice of I. I like how Adams says it here, because he says anywhere along this axis. Well, this is not on that axis. This is inside. This is centralized significantly. I is a very centralized sound. The simpler explanation is not to put it here, but to put it here. I. Sounds like that pinguior sound that we were reading in that grammarian earlier. But it was impossible to determine from the evidence where an e, as written in a Republican inscription for an expected I, might have been located on the I-E axis. And it cannot be stated with any confidence that the handful of Republican e misspellings reflects exactly the position of articulation that I had at the time when it merged with I, a merger that was not possible in classical Latin of the Republic when there were still oppositions of vowel length that would have kept e and I distinct. He is very politely, I don't know if he has a particular point to try to prove against the system that Allen has, the way that I, of course, confess that I do, but this itself tears apart the idea that the Latin short I must be e. It could be anywhere on here for early Latin, and that doesn't even apply to classical Latin, is essentially what he's saying. And I opine, why there? Why couldn't it just be E? Why does it have to be E? It doesn't... my instinct was always that it didn't make a lot of sense to me. Of course, once I got my hands on something like this, on this book by Adams, I had the statistical evidence to back up my gut instinct. Gut instincts aren't necessarily right. In fact, they don't have to be right at all, especially in science. But I believe it was. It is unwarranted to take the changes in quality undergone by short vowels as sufficient evidence for the collapse of the Latin vowel quantity system. This means quantity, as suggested by most reference works on the Latin Romance transition. So that's sort of the thing. People talk about, there's this vulgar Latin, there's this alternative language or vowel system. Most of that has been so well debunked for so long. I don't think it's even necessary to talk about here, especially for longtime viewers of my content. But that's the argument being made here, that of course there wasn't an alternative vowel system. There wasn't a sub-language that was going on underneath classical Latin. It was all just variants of the same language. Just like if you saw the video on the change from Latin to Italian, D'Achille, that author, he says exactly that. So the Republican evidence will be alluded to again, but little can be made of it, not least because the misspellings are so few. So according to Adams, the very evidence that Allen uses is essentially worthless. It does not tell us nearly enough. The misspellings are few. You made you think, oh, this is like always happening. It's not. It's very rare. And there can be many explanations that go beyond some kind of phonemic quality contrast, especially one that might anticipate the Romance mergers, which they don't. absolutely don't. So Alan's mentioning of them, it seems like a slam dunk for him, but in actuality, little can be made of them. Okay, so then this section here, which is very interesting, but I'm just going to go through it. It talks about the effect of stress accent. So what stress accent does, and this has been true with Latin for its whole history as long as we've had information on it, going back to the kind of Old Latin, Proto-Italic, and other dialects, is we see that the stress accent causes vowels to change in quality and also vowels to change in length. So that's something that stress accent can do. In final syllables of certain types, there's a tendency to shortening from relatively early. For example, final O increasingly appears as short in the early empire. I could try to quote something by Marshall, but Marshall is a great example because we see this more and more in Marshall, Juvenal, that final O, also final E. Now in Latin, classical Latin, they're always long. There are few words that are used so often like ego, shortened to ego, tibi, shortened to tibi, and so forth, that one can actually make them short or make them long in classical Latin literature, and that the short O, the shortening from O to O, is a characteristic of the early empire. Section 7, all right. Early imperial evidence for changes in the front vowel system. Now this is where we finally have the beginnings of actual usable evidence to talk about that which becomes the Romance languages. For example, pira becoming pera. That's what we're looking for. So far, all that we saw in all that early inscription stuff, not it. It has, however, been seen from the Republican evidence that a misspelling of this type need not mean that the Proto-Romance vowel merger had taken place. If in the early imperial period, E had opened to say E, and by this symbol he means this, E, it would still have been distinct from the or whatever quality you want to give it, if phonemic differences of vowel length had not yet been lost. I think it's interesting, again, he never, ever identifies the short E sound with this lax centralized vowel, because that's what I'm arguing against in particular. Something that's more on this axis is just linguistically more reasonable. This is more characteristic of a stable vowel system, not one that's in a state of change. The question must always be asked whether a particular misspelling might not be a special case, determined not by the new quality of original E, but by a non-phonetic factor. Okay, so we see letters of Terentianus. All right, we see nesse, sene, volueret, nessi, not ad, but aiutaveret, dicet, lentiamina, dicet, lentiamina again, and nesse. So he talks about these in detail. The first of nesse may be archaizing. The form nessi occurs in the early inscriptions, so this nessei. So there are also cases of nisei in Republican inscriptions. So the second vowel grapheme in Terentianus might reflect the early Latin long close e. So this is an early Latin thing. There used to be a difference between, say, filii and filiae, a difference between the nominative plural and the genitive singular. This is a difference that can actually be seen in Plautus. In classical Latin, it had mostly gone, but there are some interesting remnants of it that Adams discusses. The e would be old-fashioned rather than a phonetic spelling. So this could close completely to something like nisi, but still be spelled in these ways just for purposes of archaizing. The idea of archaizing, I mean, things that are antiquiores literally means better in Latin idiom. E deriving from original ei. The original diphthong ei changed in Latin to e, deico into dico. This spelling in particular can be found in Gallus, that friend of Virgilius, Virgil's friend. None of his writings had survived until something had turned up in Egyptian papyri, and deico, this form with de instead of dico, is actually there in his spelling from the 1st century BC. So that is not representative of how things were actually pronounced. He was using an archaic spelling, as many people probably were wont to do. But from about 150 BC, there turns up an intermediate form represented by the letter E, which must stand, in this case, for E. I wish he would use IPA, so it could be E or E. Up here, it makes sense to me, E. E gave way to E, which makes sense, though there are signs that it lingered on in country dialects longer than in urban Latin. Calabrese later will comment on exactly that. The E spelling had a tendency to turn up as archaic orthography. For example, deum, another example of this archaic orthography. Deum from deum instead of dium, in fact, divorum. That is what the actual word would be. So the change of A to E becomes relevant to the interpretation of our E spellings under particular circumstances. The spelling E for E is not uncommon in later texts in disyllabic words such as tibe, sibe, ube. By the way, these words are found in Sardinian. The word for where in Sardinian is uve. It's spelled like that. We also see words like tibe or tive in Sardinian. So there's either a relationship with the early Latin, or there's something else that's going on that could actually be descriptive, at least of a dialect that Sardinian came from. In all these words, the second syllable originally contained the diphthong a. That changed by the normal process to e, and the e, for its part, was shortened by iambic shortening to I. If a term such as sibi is written with e in the second syllable in an imperial text or inscription, it may be tempting to see e as representing the close e, which was the outcome in Romance of classical Latin e. But it follows from what has been said above that there is another way of interpreting the e spellings. So sibe, thus a spelling of an intermediate second stage in the development, sibe, sibi, would in fact be sibe as an intermediate. Thus, the spelling sibe need not reflect the late vowel merger at all, or even an open quality of e of the type commented on above in early Latin. It might rather be an old-fashioned spelling identical in type to that seen in deum. Absolutely. Also, it could be like Quintilianus said about heri instead of heri. Livy wrote sibe and quasi rather than sibi and quasi. So here Quintilianus is saying that he did this, but this was not how he pronounced it. It is inconceivable that Livy and other literary figures use such spellings as a reflection of a proto-Romance vowel merger that was taking place in speech. They must have been using orthography with an old-fashioned flavor to it, indeed. When an e spelling for classical Latin e was found in a later text in a position in which early Latin e had once occurred, it is unsafe to conclude that the e reflects a recent development in the vowel system. The possibility must be allowed that it is archaizing. This is a big deal, these archaizings and these fancy things and using different kinds of spellings in order to make things look special is a huge thing that we have to consider and filter. So this seine in Republican Latin, presumably a false archaism based on observation of the interchange of a and e. As for lentiamen instead of linteamen, whereas of course this change of the e to e, which he talks about in other places, the hiatus, it could be that they just got the order wrong. That's possible too. For example, in the Vindolanda, we have beneficiario, another interchange, which does not have to represent the onset of Romance tendencies. It could be just misordering of the sequence of the same letters. From this text, tibe, scribes, mites, maybe the future, scribes, mites, scribes, intro, very interesting. Intro may show Greek influence, since the Greek n corresponds to Latin in. Apart from intro, all such instances are final syllable. Now, here's where we start to see the phenomenon take shape. Here's something else, Archive of Sulpici, uve, again. This looks like old orthography. Uvei is an attested spelling. So, debet. The spelling is in an unstressed syllable, as is dabes for dabis, dabet, and signabet. There are only 10 possible examples in the Vindolanda tablets, 5 of them in verb forms and 2 possibly reflecting old orthography. Ube, ibe. Dabes. In this text, dabes occurs 3 times. Another text, Gaulish short e is attested as opening to e in final or unstressed syllables. That's very interesting. In the 4 letters from Mons Claudianus, these are 2nd century, and there are no misspellings of this type. 2nd century legal document. we have Greek words like this. This is interrogatione. And we see en, again, could be just a Greek ism to make it look like Greek instead of in. And also vigenti for viginti. Is this the same as those Republican transliterations showing epsilon for Latin e, motivated by the relative openness of Latin e to the Greek ears? It absolutely could be. In fact, I think that's most likely. To show you once again, Italian has 7 vowels. Modern Greek has the 5 vowel qualities, right? So when modern Greeks say their e, it sounds closer to e to modern Italian ears a lot of the time. And likewise, Italians, when they make the iota sound, the e sound, it usually sounds too close to Greeks. Thus, the explanation is that the phonemic sound for Latin might be just like modern Greek. It can still be e, essentially, but it could be a little bit lower. Nor does there need to be clear distinction between the long and the short versions. Mid-3rd century, no examples. It is possible that the absence of misspellings of this type is a reflection of a feature of the African vowel system. Spanish curse tablet, 2 front vowel misspellings, final syllable could be just old-fashioned in type, like the merito we saw above. In this 5 early letters on papyrus, no such misspellings. 2 early letters, no examples. 1st century BC, no examples. 2nd, 3rd centuries, the only misspellings are dicet, futuet, omnis. Some statistics. Okay, let's look at this. And these are my numbers here in violet. 45 misspellings showing e for classical Latin e were considered from the 14 corpora. About 23 were dismissed as special cases of one type or another. A further 20 or 21 were in the final syllable of verb forms. So 46 minus 23 minus 21 is 2. So 2 that don't have another explanation or aren't in the final syllable. This demonstrates, contrary to what Alan would like us to think, this is not a widespread phenomenon. This is an incredibly isolated phenomenon, and statistically can be explained by simply making a mistake. It could be just about the literacy of the stonemasons or the scribes. It's not nearly frequent enough to come to any conclusions yet, but let's go to the Pompeiian graffiti. So, Vaaninen, he divides material into 3 categories. Cases under the accent or pre-tonic, after the accent but in non-final syllables, and in final syllables. Here are some examples. Pravessimus, domine, mullirebu, munerebu. The last 2 examples are identical in type to tempestatibus, te instead of ti, in an early Latin inscription. And he says, le timbre indicie que devait avoir toute voyelle dans cette syllabe qui était aussi la plus sujette à la syncope. So the indecisive timbre that should have all vowel in this syllable, which was also subject to syncope. We also see nominal endings. So omnes for omnis, aled for alid. This looks like the idealis for idealis. And he categorizes the e as indicating une prononciation ouverte de i, an open pronunciation of this e. He lists numerous examples of e for e in verb endings of the 3rd conjugation, 1st and 2nd person singular, so es and et, in both the present and perfect tenses, and also the future. In this list, there are about 43 examples in the present tense, which include 3 instances of dicet, a spelling found in the letter of Terentianus, and 10 in the perfect. The instances in the perfect, which include fecit, are easy to account for. The S spelling in the 3rd person is early, both with the following letter D and T, and was very persistent into the imperial period, particularly in certain verbs, most notably fecit instead of fecit. There are 14 instances of fecit, and it's transliterated like this into Greek. The regularity of this transliterated form would not favor the view that there had been a merger of classical Latin e and e in the early empire, since the 2 vowels are rendered by different letters in Greek. It follows that in the perfect, the spellings with e at Pompeii may simply be old-fashioned. It would not be convincing to put them down at Pompeii of this period to Oscan influence. Oscan retained the ending ed, as in deded, for dedit in classical Latin, because the F forms go back to Latin itself to a period much earlier than that of the Pompeian graffiti in the 1st century AD. And they clearly had a traditional character by the time when they were written at Pompeii. In the present tense, the F forms are more problematic, though. There is not the textual evidence to determine whether an S spelling in a verb such as dicet, for dicit, was established in early Latin, though it can be constructed as original deiceti. In Oscan proper, E is not attested in the third person present of the third conjugation. Vannanen is nevertheless inclined to see the influence of Oscan at Pompeii in the present tense F forms. However, S spellings are found at Pompeii in the final syllable of futures as well, in which Oscan could not have been influential. For the futures ibet and pugnabit, an Oscan future is didest, with syncope of the vowel in the ending. So this feature at least is not due to Oscan influence. There are at least 4 ways of explaining a form such as dicet at Pompeii. 1. It might be a traditional spelling, which merely happens not to be attested in early texts. 2. The E might have spread from the perfect of dedit to other tenses. 3. It might show Oscan influence. Or 4. It might reflect a weak articulation of the vowel in final syllable. It is not obviously justifiable to latch onto 3, that it's Oscan, amid the possibilities. The simplest explanation of the F forms in tenses other than the perfect is that they all reflect the same phonetic feature, namely an openness of E in verb endings in final syllable. So that's what's going on. Allen's argument is that inscriptional evidence of early Latin and Imperial Latin, where we see confusions of E and E, is due to the fact that it's the short vowel E is actually E. Now, all the early Latin stuff is not worth anything. Adams has demonstrated that very convincingly. Here in the Imperial, we're starting to see the first signs of it, but it's only syllable final. Further statistics. So the number of S spellings for E rises to about 111 when we start to put them all together, and of these, a very high number, 73, are in verb endings. All told, more than 90 of the 111 spellings considered above are in final syllables. That statistic suggests the manner in which readjustment to the front vowel system must have been getting underway in the early centuries of the empire. Final syllables never bore a stress accent, with of course the very few exceptions, not worth mentioning, and for that reason, vowels in this position were historically subject to modifications, such as loss, humke to hunk, fake to fak, opening of facili to facile, and shortening. We therefore have, at roughly the same period, the early centuries AD, evidence both for shortening in final syllables and for a change in quality of short E in such syllables. As E opened, it will have moved close to E without merging with it. Let's talk for a moment about Sardinian. Sardinian has a vowel system that looks a lot like the one at Pompeii. The vowel qualities that we have in Sardinian probably indicate that the kind of Latin that Sardinians inherited was strongly influenced by the kind of Latin in the dialect spoken in Pompeii. For example, not mentioned here, but in Pompeian graffiti, where we actually see poems, people writing in hexameter and things like that, we see a 4th conjugation, dormit, with a long E sound. Now, in urban Latin, in the Latin of the city of Rome, that had shortened. Final T shortens vowels. You don't get to have a long E sound. But Pompeii, in that dialect, which seems to have a feature derived from a more archaic version of Latin, it could have been urban Latin when Pompeii got incorporated into the Republic. But in urban Latin, that was gone. So, dormit, we have that kind of long thing. And also we see facet in Pompeii. Well, what does Sardinian have? It has dormit and facet, spelled F-A-K-E-T, facet. And dormit looks just like Latin. This is clearly indicative that we have some weakening of the final vowel And that's the only place that Sardinian demonstrates a short E becoming E. And that was happening in the 1st century AD, at least in Pompeii. And the fact that it's dormit, not dormet, indicates that that's the kind of vowel system that got transferred into it with those qualities. We already have more than enough evidence to quietly dismiss Allen's system, but we're going to go on. We therefore have roughly at the same period, the early centuries AD, evidence both for shortening of final syllables and for a change in the quality of short E in such syllables. It is likely that in a verb such as dabis, the final front vowel was articulated in a reduced tension and that it tended to open slightly. So from E to E. So not dabis, but dabis. It's not a big difference, but that can show up in inscriptions. As E opened, it will have moved close to E without merging with it. Evidence for the part played by the stress accent in undermining the quantitative system only appears in abundance from the 3rd century. So anyone who, this is also very important, my soapbox, the hill that I've chosen to die on, so to speak, the one that I defend most of all, is that phonemic vowel quantity is just essential for understanding and working with Latin, teaching it. The reason I hammer on that so much is not a lot of people do that. People use the classical pronunciation, or they think they do, but they haven't had the experience or the training or someone to help teach them and show them what it sounds like to distinguish regularly femina from femina, the ablative. They might have tried it once or twice, but then they don't even try it ever again. And if they don't write macrons, it becomes that much harder to adapt. Of all the things we have to do when pronouncing Latin in any pronunciation system, phonemic vowel length is absolutely essential. And if we're using a classical pronunciation system of whatever type, you can use the Allen system, fine. But if you're not using the actual quantity distinctions, I don't see any point to doing it. Similarly, the mid-century transliterated text above, which, given that the Greek alphabet distinguishes better than Latin between short and long vowels, is virtually a phonetic transcription and shows no sign of a breakdown in the quantitative system. So that's very interesting. And he talks about that a bit more. Iota is repeatedly used for E, though. That's interesting. And the one departure from the classical norms in this respect is consistent with the tendency to opening in the short vowel system as distinct from a merger across the short and long vowel systems. Okay, so there's no merger going on. It could only be concluded that the Proto-Romance merger was fully in progress if spellings were more widely distributed within the word that they are in our early imperial documents, and if there was evidence for a disturbance in the quantitative system. Well, that's interesting. So apparently in the imperial times, we're not getting that confusion anymore. Well, what's going on by imperial Greek? Hundreds of years earlier, Greek had a vowel space which looked a little bit more like the Italian one. It has U too, which is like French, which is one of the reasons I brought it up earlier. But it doesn't have this kind of vowel space anymore. Oh, I just noticed that's terribly misspelled. There we go, vowel space. I'm sure there's plenty of typos in my notes here. So by imperial times, ancient Greek doesn't have this kind of vowel space anymore. That's because the E has fully merged to E by the end of the 1st century BC. So the 1st century AD, we have E, U, E, O, and A. So we have something similar, more similar to the modern Greek qualities, plus U, of course. So if Imperial Greek is regularly using iota for Latin short E, it stands to reason that this explanation of the vowel space may be what's going on. And thus, the older inscriptional Greek stuff with lepedos is maybe just demonstrating that back then, the Greeks had a higher E than the Romans, which might have had E instead of E, a slight difference, a very slight one that they could hear, but then they couldn't perceive it anymore because those scribes didn't have it in their native Greek. Okay, Latin and Oscan vowel systems. Scholars have not been lacking who have attributed the Latin or Proto-Romance development to Italic influence, so non-Latin influence, in Italy. This idea will be hard to prove, particularly for later in Proto-Romance periods. So this is a fascinating idea that in Italy there are other dialects of Italic, There are even other versions of Latin. There are other languages going on there. There's stuff like Etruscan. And it's tempting to say, that region of Italy today, like say Tuscany, or other kinds of Latin, became the various dialects in Italy today because of substrate influence. That is possible, but most of these changes can also just happen spontaneously. They don't require substrate influence. The tendency for Latin E to open particularly in final syllables in the material just seen is a restricted adjustment which would not need an external cause. And it is attested mainly in the empire when Oscan was in decline and is not confined to areas where Oscan had been spoken. So Oscan is not influencing this characteristic at Pompeii. Vowels and final syllables were subject to various forms of weakening. The open character of E in early Latin, such that it was sometimes apparently heard by Greeks as indeterminate between E and E, might have been a widespread feature of languages or dialects in parts of Italy, as is attested to in Faliscan. So this is very interesting. So that the mistakes could have come from other dialects, other speakers of Latin who weren't the native Roman speakers, and they had a different kind of vowel quality, and the Greeks heard them differently. But let's not forget that the Greeks have a whole bunch of other dialects going on as well. And this is to demonstrate that even my hypothesis of it being a vowel space thing, that since Latins the Romans had a vowel space that was more like this 5 system of E, E on the front, whereas the Greeks in the early Republican times had E and E. My hypothesis is saying that this is probably the cause of lepedos, instead of it being something particular about instead of the Latin one having I necessarily. Well, even that, because of all the different things going on, that's not very clear, good evidence. But then when we have the more standardized dialects in imperial times, and we see Greek spelled feket or peket, however you want to pronounce it, for feket, that's very strong evidence. That's much stronger evidence than the early stuff, which was incredibly rare anyway. Later Latin and front vowels. Okay, many instances of E written for classical Latin E in later inscriptions from Gaul, these contrast sharply in their diversity with restricted character of early imperial misspellings. So we see basilica, menus, meser, nemis, precepubus, principibus. So under the stress, tetolus, uteletas, ancella, claressimus, dulcessimus, minester, also menister, megravit, figura, menores, fidelis, trebunus. So many of these ought to be E, but they're actually E. Maximus nobilis. By the way, this would also demonstrate that sonus medius, that mid-sound for like maximus, had become a full E, maximus, like Caesar recommended. So one can certainly pronounce the sonus medius if you want, but it's, I think, perfectly correct to say it as a normal E sound, maximus, especially given what happens in the later Latin. But you can use sonus medius. I like sonus medius. So Spanish inscriptions, misspellings, prominent in final syllables but not restricted to them. It is impossible to dismiss the Gallic and Spanish evidence en masse to comprising old spellings and special cases of one sort or another. A lot of them are not dated, but they're probably quite late. So we're talking, here we are, 4th to 6th and even 7th century AD. So long after a lot of these vowel changes ought to have happened universally. A step forward in the passage from classical vowel system to the Romance. So the effects of the stress accent on the quantitative system between the 3rd and 5th centuries. So what have we seen so far? We've seen there is inscriptional evidence of a confusion in early Latin, well before the classical period, which is over here is 1st century BC. So we're talking about 4th, 3rd, 2nd century. We see confusions in the very time period when the Latin vowel system is having a switch of E to I and O to U in certain positions, thus creating confusion for scribes. That can explain that. We also see Greek transcriptions where the epsilon is being used where we would expect maybe iota. However, in this time period, the Greek vowel system still has E, that long epsilon iota vowel sound, contrasted with E, most likely pushing the sound of iota farther closed. And the result is that the perfectly normal sounding E, something like modern Greek, is actually what Latin has, and modern Greeks with a more sensitive ear, something like modern Italians, to those subtle quality differentiations, represent it thus. In any case, there are so few misspellings in this time period that they're not even statistically relevant. The first time we see any front vowel changes, that is from letter I to letter E, E to E, is in the 1st century. Here's Vesuvius, by the way, a little volcano emoji. So in the 1st century, graffiti in Pompeii, though not exclusively, demonstrates in syllable final position a weakening. This happens to be the quality system that we see in Sardinian. So probably Sardinian picked up Latin even from this time period. Sardinia was captured by the Roman Republic back here in the late 3rd century, and we can assume colonization in the classical period. And given that it has that exact same thing, that contrast between dormit and facet, which in Sardinian is dormit and facet, that is a very strong indicator that the qualities of Sardinian are representative of what's going on in the classical Latin period, especially here, and for the dialect in particular, that is represented in Pompeii, which has an archaism that the longer E sound like dormit was retained, but an innovation as well, changing the E to E. Neither of those happen to be in the contemporary urban Latin. In the 2nd century, Velius Longus, here he is, Velius Longus tells us that there's a difference in quality between prodire and prodit. Probably it's a slight lowering of the short E in the final syllable. Then, many centuries later, we get additional commentary from these late grammarians. And when it comes to the inscriptions we were just talking about here, we see the generalized phenomenon of this disciplina, dedecavit, dulcessimus, minester, menus, and so forth. All those things we see in late Western Roman Empire times. And also, Romanian shows this same vowel change, the change of E to E, while it doesn't show the back vowels, which we're going to get to next. Interestingly, Dacia, Dacia, Trajan captures Dacia in 106, and eventually it's evacuated in 275 in the late 3rd century. Since we, as it says here, between the 3rd and 5th centuries is when we see the generalization of the phenomenon of E to E. That happens to also 3rd century, happens to be probably when there was some colonization going on in Dacia. Now, those might be coincidental. It's not necessary that Romanian come from colonists who stayed on the other side of the Danube and didn't leave with the rest of the Romans. Romanian may have come from a Romance language that was actually south of the Danube after the evacuation. However, the time periods match, and that's very interesting, and that might be helpful to understand a little bit of what happened north of the Danube after 275, possibly, though not necessarily. The point is that Romanian demonstrates the front vowel phenomena found in Western Romance, but Sardinian does not, except for final syllables. Let's go to the back vowel merger. The conventional view is that the merger of the back vowels O and U as close U was later than the corresponding merger of the front vowel axis. And of course, I sustain this if it's going to go about proving it. Nor did the merger take place everywhere. In Romanian, as was seen, U did not shift to a close U, though the standard change took place in the front vowel system, as we just covered. There are texts in which spelling confusion in the back vowel system is non-existent. The relative infrequency of that confusion, compared with spelling confusion in the front vowel system, cannot be explained away as a statistical freak. Any statistical account of spellings showing O for U, which does not cite the evidence, must also be treated with suspicion, so that of gang. Interesting that he's kind of throwing some shade at older philologists. I like this Adams guy. Because many such spellings turn out to be special cases irrelevant to developments in the later vowel system. Most notable among these is the writing of uo rather than uu, where the first letter represents a semivowel W, keeping in mind that Latin doesn't have the difference between V and U that we take for granted in our Latin texts today. And the second, a short vowel. There was a reluctance to repeat the letter with a different phonetic value, and for that reason, old spellings such as servos persisted. We can even see this in Virgil's text, for instance. Divom, for example, instead of divum. Why is that there? Just a dissimilation of the spelling. It has nothing to do with pronunciation, and it happens to be old-looking, old-fashioned looking. Think of ye old tavern, which is actually, of course, the old tavern. It's just that the Y was used as a grapheme to represent the thorn letter, the TH letter sound for the, so it's the old tavern, not ye. But the spelling of it that way was just to represent something archaic, because old stuff is fun. Look at us talking about all this old stuff. Okay, so looking at the letters of Terentianus, talking 2nd century again, there are examples of this interchange, but everyone is a special case. There's the wo, like salvom, novum, fugitium. This was considered proper spelling. In general, do the was a bit more novel, even though they were actually pronouncing it salvum. Quintilian remarks on this specifically, that our teachers taught us to spell it this way, even though it doesn't sound like that. Con, which may either retain the old Latin vowel spelling, which was con, or it could be an influence of all the compounds like confido. We also see quominos and sopera. It would not do to argue that here is a sign of the late back-vowel merger, because the non-syncopated form, it's sopera instead of supra. This is the word supra, over, right? So why is it sopera with that non-syncopated form? That's super weird. Why is that? Because it's suggestive of early Latin. Supera, for supra, is in Livius Andronicus. And the O, too, may have been conceived of by the scribe as old-fashioned, and therefore better. Old-fashioned is better. Archive of Sulpici, no examples. Vindolanda, no examples. Vindonisa tablets, no examples. No examples, no examples. 2nd century legal document, no examples. In North Africa, no examples. Spanish curse tablet, there's this morbos, but otherwise it's just an old spelling. 5 early letters, no examples, no examples, no examples, no examples. Pompeiian graffiti, our favorite. The evidence is treated comprehensively by Vanenen. The vast majority of spellings showing O where U might have been expected are placed under the heading O pour U classique, O pour U classique, O archaïque. And there are old spellings mainly of the type seen above in Terentianus. At 27, just 4 instances are cited of O pour U originaire, O for original U. But all of these are special cases or of doubtful interpretation. At Pompeii, there is no sign of a back-vowel merger. Conclusion: there is not a single case in this material of an O spelling that might be interpreted as showing opening of short U in anticipation of vowel merger. In the same material, in the front vowels, there are cases of opening. The usual view of the relative chronology of these vowel changes must be correct. So to look on our timeline, we expect after the 5th century this vowel change of the back vowels to take place. We'll see later that the au diphthong was quite persistent. So before the end of the Western Roman Empire, we have the I to E becoming a generalized phenomenon, but not the O to U, at least not till the very end, at the earliest. Later Latin and back vowels. Even in late inscriptions, it is not easy to find examples of O for U that can be put down to a change in the back vowel system. There's anoro for anorum, possibly due to a tendency to open, but it could be explained otherwise, for example, as showing vocalic assimilation to the stressed vowel. The few other cases cited by Carnoy are slips or can be accounted for as case confusions. The writing of ablative forms instead of accusative, either mechanically or because of a sense that the ablative was appropriate. So, in this Christian period, Carnoy has just 8 examples of this. Arcos, porticos, Caesaros, all taken to be Celtic forms. Isto monumento is interesting. It is noticeable that the U in the second syllable, monumento, is still there. So if the vowel change had taken place in this specific example, it should be monumento, not monumento. So it's probably something else going on. Carnoy has examples from the 4th to the 8th centuries. These are more convincing. Caesaragosta for Caesar Augusta, very interesting. Columba subitus tumulo for Columba subitus tumulo or tumulus. The Spanish evidence is consistent with a back vowel change at a late period, a very late period. The inscriptions in Gaul, There are numerous misspellings showing O for U that cannot be explained away as special cases. Many misspellings that must reflect a back-vowel merger. Tomulo, tetolo, consoles, seculares, famula, regola, popoli. This looks absolutely like a Romance language now, doesn't it? And it's all very late. So, 7th century of O written for U. The misspelling is less common than the corresponding one on the front vowel axis, but it remains true that most examples are consistent with a vowel merger. Conclusions. Adjustments of the vowel system must have taken place in several stages. In the early Republic, there are already signs that E had an open quality that caused it to be written sometimes as E. It might have had some such value as E. Now, what he actually means in IPA, I mean, this is fine for him, but we like IPA. He means either A or maybe even with the arrow symbol, which looks like an upside-down T, the elevate, so they get E. He definitely doesn't cite I, the way that Allen does, and the way it's printed in how many millions of textbooks around the world, but would have remained distinct from E as long as the system of quantitative oppositions was in place. The tendency to opening of E shows up in non-literary documents of the first 3 centuries AD, mainly in the final syllable of verb endings. Throughout this period, there is no trace of comparable opening of the mid-back vowel. In the next stage, opening of E appears more extensively in different parts of the word, both in accented and unaccented syllables. Between the 3rd and 5th centuries, the stress accent can be seen to have affected the quantitative system, and the open quality of classical Latin E would now have made it vulnerable to a merger with original E. Also, in the late period, signs appear of a comparable adjustment in the back vowels. So, the back vowel change, 4th, 5th, 6th century, 7th century, not before. And interestingly, Dacia is evacuated in the century prior. Romanian has the front vowel merger and other mutations, and none of the back ones that are found in the rest of Romance, excepting, of course, Sardinian and Southern Lucanian and North African. All right, so regional variation. Vocalic misspellings of the types considered here are extremely common in later inscriptions of Gaul, but almost non-existent in Africa. So think about the idea that North Africa was colonized since the end of Carthage, right? So there was a Romance language there. That Northern Romance language went extinct. Given the relatively date of the corpus, the absence of misspellings need not be indicative of an African peculiarity. But the Albertini tablets are much later, the late 5th century. Where's our late 5th century? Okay, Pompeius may still be alive. And they're very extensive. They are replete with every type of misspelling. Yet the 2 vocalic misspellings of E and E and U and O are virtually non-existent. So we would expect all kinds of misspellings, but the very thing that is supposed to happen in all of Romance, or should have happened according to Allen in early Latin, it's not there. This is not an anomaly. This is the rule, which we'll see. There are only 2 certain cases of E for E, auricularis and inutilem. Only 2. Very interesting. The letter I, representing the short E sound, is correctly written about 182 times, compared with just 1 case of E for E, and that is the special case, being sibe, which we understand to be either archaic or something like Sardinian. In the tablet 11, there are half a dozen singular verb forms ending in it, of the sort in which the S spelling often turns up elsewhere. So, doesn't have that thing that happens even in Sardinian and in the Pompeiian inscriptions. Africans, they pronounce the original O as O, and their E as E. The vowel system of that Augustine describes about the Africans, in which long and short O merged, as well as short E with long E. Such is the vowel system of Sardinian. The inscriptional evidence from Africa is consistent with the vowel system of the Sardinian type. So Sardinian has this vowel system where the shorts and the longs of Latin just merge together. We don't get E to E mutation. We don't get U to O mutation. In African, Sardinian, Southern Lucanian, and half of it, the back axis stuff, over in Romania. Though certainty is impossible, and that's fair to say. While modern Romance languages are obviously attested, they're living languages, the North African Proto-Romance language is only something we can reconstruct. The sharp contrast between the evidence from Africa and that of Gaul suggests a distinction between the vowel systems of the two places in about the 5th century. Very interesting. Final conclusion, social variation in vowels. Signs of opening E are already to be found in the Republican period. In the early empire, the tendency is most marked in final syllables. From about the 3rd century AD, evidence accumulates for a shortening of long, unstressed vowels and for a complementary lengthening of stressed vowels, and not only in open syllables, not least in final syllables. So 2 developments that were the sine qua non for the vowel system of most of the Romance languages. Most is okay. Yeah, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian. Namely, the opening of E towards position of articulation of E and a corresponding opening of U to O. That one doesn't happen in Romanian, this does. And the loss of phonemic distinctions of vowel quantity, that's universal. This may have started in final syllables or have been more advanced there early on. By the later period, notably about the 5th century, we find numerous misspellings suggestive of, number 1, the opening of E to E in other parts of the word, not just the syllable final, and evidence in grammarians and others for the loss of distinctions in quantity, and not only in final syllables. So this is consistent with gradual change, not a system that was constant since the Old Latin period, as Allen wants us to believe. Starting from the opening of the front high vowel E in the Republic and moving on to the undermining of the system of quantity and the opening of U much later. The view advanced by Pilgrim that there had long been a submerged vowel system of the Romance type alongside that of Classical Latin receives no support from the evidence. This is what I've often said about the whole Vulgar Latin thing. It would be unjustifiable to refer to as distinct and separate vowel system of Vulgar Latin. There would have been purists who felt that the writing of E, where historically short E was expected, was substandard. But that is not to say that the educated classes who always wrote E correctly did not themselves pronounce short E with a position of articulation close to that of short E, which of course doesn't really exist as a grapheme. It would just be an alteration of the vowel sound. It would be the modern Greek vowel sound, where this E is often going to sound like E. It's going to lower E. In the early Republic, when spelling had not been standardized to the extent that was later to be the case, there are letter E spellings, E, even in learned compositions, like the Scipionic Elogia, which testify to the openness of the vowel E in educated speech, at least back then. Or, of course, the other possibility that because that vowel shift had happened or was already going on, that it just created confusion for scribes, and again, it wasn't standardized. All right, so I'm going to keep repeating the argument of Allen and try to do it justice. Allen's argument is we have inscriptional evidence of early Latin, Imperial Latin, late Latin, where E is written for E and O is written for U, and vice versa. Vice versa, that can't necessarily mean anything. That might just be a type of illiteracy or partial literacy, especially if it doesn't form a consistent pattern. All of the early Latin stuff, completely thrown out because there's not nearly enough of it, and it's explained much better by other things. I explain it by scribal error due to the vowel shift that occurred in Old Latin, or to the difference in the vowel spaces of ancient Greek, which looked more like modern Italian, and ancient Latin, which looked like more like modern Greek. It's a fun little switch, little do-si-do there. We do see F or E in the 1st century, not just in Pompeii, but in other places, but only syllable final. Vedius Longus, the first grammarian to confirm this, and then from the 3rd century as a generalized phenomenon. It occurs in Romanian, but the back vowels don't. So Allen's argument is that this is something that was always part of Latin. There was always this 9-quality vowel system, because incidentally, the only way it works is if even in pre-classical Latin there was a closed E and U and short E and O, instead of just having exactly the same qualities for those mid-vowels. Allen is arguing we have inscriptional evidence. Well, nothing pre-imperial. The imperial stuff only exclusively tells us syllable final. So his contention that it's I and U, the U stuff, that's completely irrelevant. There's no way that's part of Latin anytime during the Western Roman Empire. So that foot's gone. The other foot of the argument is the front vowels. Well, front vowels, very exclusive to the final syllables, if anywhere during the classical Latin period, which is here, starting roughly in 100 BC, going roughly to 200 AD. That's generally when we talk about classical Latin. You only get one kind of change, and it's a very isolated environment. So Allen has essentially no inscriptional evidence to support the argument of I and U as phonemic qualities to the short vowels of letter I and letter U. The other part of the argument is Romance. Well, Romance languages demonstrate, according to Allen, that we have pira becoming pera, we have culpa becoming culpa, but we have not just one, we have 3 Romance languages, including that North African one, which don't demonstrate any of that, and Romanian only demonstrates the front and not the back vowels. Also Aromanian, by the way, which is just another bit of evidence. So to say there's this Romance system of Allen, it's isolated, and it only seems to pertain to those languages which had a closer connection after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Not surprisingly, by land, not including that island over in Sardinia, most of Italy, most of France, most of Spain, most of Portugal, those areas still were in contact, and they were sharing these sounds and these phonological developments. The last argument that Allen has is that, well, we can still expect with a phonemic vowel length system that the short variants will be more centralized, that they will be lax. That we have a long E, then we should expect a short I. Long U should give us a short U. Long E, or E, whatever it is, should give us a short E. And long U should give us a short O. Like there should be more peripheral for the long ones and more centralized on the vowel space for the short ones. Before we get to that, let's look briefly at the diphthongs. Now, there isn't that much to say. Again, I'm not really concentrating on the diphthongs. I'm mostly talking about short letter I and short letter U today. But essentially, we see that the evidence show, not surprisingly, the exact same thing. I, that A aspect, well, that's on the front axis, right? Let me get to this IPA chart here. So the I becomes an E over here. Those changes happen, indeed, during the imperial times. And it's very interesting that most likely, when we're talking about vowel space, the long closed E sound, like we get with that evitat, or evitat, however it was pronounced, that evitat that the 5th century grammarian was talking about, well, that's probably getting pushed up because there's a long open E from the letter AE, because the letter AE becomes E. That monophthongization happens in the early centuries of the empire. So the 4th century, the monophthong was so established that it was acceptable even to grammarians. When it comes to vowel space, I think it's just more likely that, yeah, you could have had the long E raising into A. Sure, that could happen. But it definitely would be happening if you have a phonemically distinct long E sound derived from the letter A, letter E diphthong, the I diphthong becoming E, pushing former E to E in order to keep them from being confused. So we do see that in the empire. The AU is interesting because just like the I, there are a few closings of it in the rustic Latin. I talked about that in the Latin to Italian video on the main channel. We see rustic Latin words that worked their way in to normal Latin. Ola, coda, plostrum, sodes, auricola, instead of cauda, plaustrum, and so forth. And sodes is just classical Latin. Auricola, for little ear, auris. This long O must have been the long close O of the classical Latin vowel system, rather than a more open variant, is what he's saying. And the reason why he's saying this is he's accepted the Allen model. He's not trying to contradict that. So he's assuming, okay, so long O in classical Latin must be closed, O, or orator, or something like that. So he's just gone and accepted that's the pronunciation in classical Latin of, say, the 1st century BC. But it couldn't be the same thing, though. But he's saying that these words that were taken in, this is the important part, he's saying that these words that became part of normal classical Latin that show a vowel change that wasn't part of the urban classical Latin system, that they must have completely merged with the regular long O. That's the point he's making here. A number of words that occur already with the O spelling in Latin are reflected in Romance with a close, not an open O. So one example of that is coda. It's coda, not coda. in Italian. But it is cosa, because cosa comes from causa. So a better explanation of this, which we'll see when we get to Calabrese, is that the Latin long O was probably just a true mid O, or maybe even an open O. It didn't have to be closed at all. And the reason is that this very import would provoke the creation of a new vowel. At least that's more likely, rather than simply merging together like this, especially when we get coda in modern Italian. It's more likely we had just whatever kind of long true mid quality of O, coda, coda, that closes to coda, because all the long vowels do that, because it's the later changes of ao, like say parabola into parola. Those are much later. The ao spelling in most words was very persistent throughout Latin, despite these things that came in from the rustic pronunciation. We have aur from aurum in Romanian, but also in Old Provençal. So the changing of the back vowels did not happen at all over in Romanian, including the au diphthong. It's this glide of the u that is determining where it falls in the axis for this diphthong and for the monophthongization of it potentially. Romanian is not showing any of the back vowel stuff, and Old Provençal hangs on to this ow. So this must be the last of the back vowel things even to change, even though it's oro in Spanish and Italian and so forth. A conservative feature of Portuguese is its preservation of the Latin ow as o. That's very interesting, isn't it? The monophthongization was therefore not the same as found in the lexical items in Latin showing the o spelling. So the ones like coda that were from cauda are a completely different phenomenon, essentially from a different dialect of Latin that got mixed together. This mixing of dialects to create the standard language happens all the time. The distinction is important as it shows that the monophthongization that turns up quite early in Latin in a small set of words has nothing to do with the later monophthongization that shows up in Romance. Hence, it is not correct to say that Italian oro, aurum shows the vulgar Latin form, since the Italian reflex has an open o, oro. It is true that a rustic form, aurum, for aurum, is attested in Latin. But the O of that form would have differed in quality, being close, later being close, from that, for example, of the Italian word. The Latin form aurum and the Italian oro derive from independent monophthongizations. It's very interesting that these phenomena can occur more than once, even in the passage of the same basic language. There is a general point that arises from the history of ao. Sometimes a superficial similarity between Latin and a Romance feature may reflect not continuity, but two separate developments. The early Latin book by Allen just hammers this. It's a great text. I'll put the link in the description to that as well. All of Allen's evidence is wrong, essentially, according to Adams. There's nothing there to support it. And what this really reminds me of is that episode of The Simpsons, that Halloween one, where the aliens abduct the Simpson family, and the aliens are all like well, they seem like they might want to eat the Simpsons, but Lisa's the only one smart enough to notice that, and she finds this book, How to Cook Humans. She finds this book that the ship's cook, this alien, is using. And then he says, oh no, there's some space dust on this. And he blows it off and says, actually, how to cook for humans. Then Lisa blows off more dust and finds that it actually says, how to cook for 40 humans. And then finally the alien says, no, there's a little bit more space dust. How to cook for 40 humans. And ultimately, the real truth is that the aliens were actually never trying to eat the Simpsons. That the superficial view that we were, as an audience, given deliberately for the sake of comedy was wrong. The superficial view that Allen takes of the Romance languages, because he just didn't look at enough of them or in much detail, and the superficial view of the inscriptions, if you just blow off a little bit more of that ancient dust, you can see that no, what he's presenting is wrong. Unless he's right that languages with phonemic vowel length just demonstrate more centralization for the short variants and more periphery for the long variants. Final conclusions, diphthongs, and social variation. The history of the term for gold discussed above provides a salutary warning against jumping to the conclusion that two superficially similar forms, one found in Republican Latin and the other in a Romance language, must be connected, because they just plain aren't. And now we're finally getting to something that I'm possibly best known for, the fact that I use the Calabrese, Andrea Calabrese, pronunciation of Latin vowels. His paper from 2002 talks about a lot of the stuff that we've already covered. And one really need only look at the evidence as presented to come to the same conclusion that Calabrese's come to, the same conclusion that, of course, he convinced me of via his paper. He talks about some terms here. Talks about ATR, advanced tongue root. The plus means that's what's going on, positive advanced tongue root, and then we see negative. Now, what does this mean? Advanced tongue root essentially means pushing to the periphery, pushing the vowels to the periphery of the vowel chart. So more, say, front and closed or more back sounding. The sounds I and U have negative ATR, and I and U are positive ATR. So hopefully that helps. Of course, that would be the high and the lower distinctions. So he goes through all this, and the whole paper is worth reading. Phonemically, classical Latin had a typical basic 5-vowel system, and that the difference of them primarily was that of length. Everyone agrees on this. That's true. We do. And those out there, especially English speakers who teach Latin, who insist on using qualities to distinguish the long and short vowels, because that's what we do traditionally for our English language with long and short vowels, as we call them, is of course wrong. And that is not how Latin works and ought, frankly, not to be taught in that way. I mean, conventions are conventions, whatever. I'd rather people learn Latin rather than not, even with a pronunciation that I don't happen to agree with. But insofar as people are actually trying to use a classical pronunciation, especially one that's based on the famous Sidney Allen, well, you should probably know that he wasn't right. But everyone agrees that the difference is a length contrast. There is, however, disagreement when we consider their surface phonetic shape, their quality. So, is length associated with quality distinctions? Two different positions can be identified. The first position, taken by Allen and Sturtevant, assumes that the short, non-low vowels of classical Latin were lower or more open than the long ones. Namely, the short, non-low vowels were negative ATR, so more central or lower, whereas the long ones were positive ATR. Whereas my position, to make it clear, is that there's just neutral ATR for both the long and the short. The alternative position, which, as far as I know, this is Calabrese speaking, is not explicitly taken by any linguist, but is implicitly present in many textbooks discussing the evolution of the Latin vowel system. And it holds that there were no distinctions in ATR values in long and short vowels in classical Latin. According to this position, the system of classical Latin was therefore where the high vowels were positive ATR and the mid vowels were negative ATR, as expected in a typical 5-vowel system, like, say, modern Greek or Spanish. So the a, that's the a. So short a, long a, short I, long I, short u, long u, short long e, short o, long o. Now, like so many other of these papers and books, we're not seeing standard IPA, but we can definitely understand what he intends here because it makes it very clear what his symbols mean. I would prefer IPA, but so be it. According to this position, a differentiation in ATR values as that in figure 2, which was the Allen model, this is I, this is U for this paper, this is O. So the Allen model developed only in later stages of Latin or was characteristic of a more popular variety of this language. Now, as we established above, and Adams went into much more detail that we skipped over, the difference between like a popular vulgar Latin versus like some upper class one essentially doesn't exist. Calabrese uses 3 pieces of evidence to support this. The first comes from the classical Latin vowel system coming into Sardinian and Southern Lucanian, also North African, he'll talk about as well. The second part of the argument is about transcriptions in Greek. Now, most of the transcriptions that he looks at are not of the early Koine or the Attic time period. They're up in the Republic and Imperial times, where the ancient Greek vowels have less of a vowel space like this and more one like this. So it ends up actually not being relevant. I've spoken directly to Calabrese about this specific thing, and he simply got his information on the ancient Greek vowel system from someone else whom he had considered an expert, and certainly I believe that person was. It's just that the time periods didn't quite match up. So he no longer considers the Greek necessarily a strong bit of evidence any more than the stuff that I told you today. And finally, we have the pronunciation mistakes reported by ancient writers. So the strongest evidence for assuming that Latin vowel system was that in 3, that is the system that I use, the Calabrese vowel systems with no ATR distinctions in the mid-vowels is provided by the more isolated or peripheral Romance varieties, where the classical Latin system appears to have evolved by losing length distinctions, specifically Sardinian and Southern Lucanian. The same development appears to have also occurred in African Latin. We've already seen this, and I accept it. It is reasonable to hypothesize that the variety of Latin where the distinctions in length were simply lost, the resulting vowels show the quality of the Latin vowel. This is not an unreasonable hypothesis. Some examples: Sardinian nive from Latin nives. Filu is from filu. Cadena is from cadena. Fele from fele. Sole from sole. Roda from rota. Ruke from kruke, that's an interesting one. And muru from muru. The Southern Lucanian shows the same kind of thing, it's just that it raises the final e to an e, or it uses this variant instead. So nivi, we have filu again, we have creta, we have soli, we have cruci, and luci. In all science, it has always been assumed in linguistics that the absence of contrary evidence, a choice among alternative accounts, is made on the basis of simplicity. Now, the system that we observe in Sardinian and Southern Lucanian, that is, the one we observe in the bottom line and 5 above that we just looked at, can be simply derived from that of classical Latin by assuming that the Latin vowels in the top line had the phonetic vowels in 3. So, assuming that we go from short E into E, and E into E, and U into U, and O into O. Simply a loss of length distinctions, a change that is independently needed for all Romance varieties. If we assume the Allen system, it becomes so much more complex. So let's just set this up. The 3 languages that demonstrate the 5 qualities: Sardinian, Southern Lucanian, North African, and also the back vowels for Romanian. So 3.5. So 3 times you have I going from negative ATR to positive ATR to E, and you have U 4 times going to U to positive ATR. This is, as he's trying to say here, as politely as possible, this is a statistical improbability, and it's simply not scientific. The Allen system, where we have these 9 qualities, is not supported by the Romance language evidence. It is vehemently contradicted by it. You have to look exclusively at Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Italian, the languages most familiar to Allen and a lot of other Western Europeans, and completely ignore all these other things. Those other things, maybe you get 1 anomaly. 2, wow, that's a lucky break. 3.5, 4 for the back vowels. It's about as probable as there were some kind of continent bridges that existed between North America and Europe and South America and Africa, which permitted plants and animals to migrate across, instead of the simpler explanation, which is that there is continental drift. The former was the theory for a long, long time. Once continental drift, through sufficient evidence, was demonstrated to be the reality, well, now we accept that. So that's where we are. We're trying to say, hey, continental drift, I know it sounds crazy, it's not what you're used to, but that's really what's going on. It is the simpler explanation. The considerable complexities which the hypothesis that Latin had the system of Allen creates a good reason for rejecting it. Absolutely. In this section, he talks about the vowel system, but he's using the Attic system, which is valid in some respects, maybe into the late Republic, but definitely not sufficiently, in my opinion, to fully justify this as a piece of evidence. We don't really need it. It follows that the urban Latin long mid-front vowel was long e. So Calabrese cites a lot of excellent evidence. We basically already seen it. It's just that Adams wasn't really considering the Romance stuff in detail in order to really notice that the Allen system just isn't supported. Or maybe he did and just didn't feel like critiquing that model. We therefore have to assume that the outcome of the diphthongization of owl in rustic Latin and along all of the classical languages were the same sound. So this is the point he's making here, that rustic Latin going from cauda to coda and coming into classical Latin, and for that merger to have happened so easily and so simply, then urban Latin must have also had an open quality. That's his argument here. Because the other O of, say, Italian, that has that open quality, that's much later. That's centuries later. We can conclude that there is clear evidence that in classical Latin, long and short mid-vowels did not have different ATR values. The Latin letters e, o actually represented the open qualities. The fact that there is no difference in the outcomes of the high vowels in Southern Lucanian and Sardinian shows that short and long high vowels had the same quality and therefore did not have different ATR values. In conclusion, there is robust evidence that the classical Latin vowel system was the Calabrese system, that there was no difference in ATR between the short and long vowels. However, at a certain point of the history of classical Latin, probably around the 1st century AD, as argued later, long and short vowels became differentiated by ATR distinctions. Long vowels became positive ATR and the short ones negative ATR. This was reported by the ancient grammarian Servius in the 5th century. So this is the kind of thing that we were already looking at. Pompeii says the same thing about how we get evitat instead of evitat. And as much as I love Dr. Calabrese's work here, because it helped me to clarify my own pronunciation in Latin as a practical thing, because that's what I'm interested in. The theory is all great, but I'm about practical Latin. I make audiobooks in Latin. I make videos in Latin. I speak Latin. So I want to do it with some kind of pronunciation that is credibly part of the history of the language. He shows how the vowels change in his system. He demonstrates the offensively absurd complexity that's necessary to explain the 3.5 anomalies. If we're just going by number of languages, there are 4 Romance languages that show the back-vowel merger and 4 that don't. That's not strong evidence for the Allen system. Very interesting and entertaining that it's taken this long for people to really notice that there's something weird with Allen's system. So a lot of goes into like how complex this have to be, but how simple it can be if you just have the differentiation of the vowel qualities happen at different times. Adams makes the argument through inscriptional evidence, and Calabrese does it through linguistic analysis and through looking at the Romance languages. He concludes, I would like to stress the importance of re-examining linguistic history in the light of the ever-evolving linguistic theory and to propose explanations of historical facts using current frameworks. Just like continental drift is a better explanation for how all these species got around the planet instead of weird land bridges that just vanished beneath the ocean. But let me play devil's advocate one more time, because Allen's argument has 3 pieces. Allen's argument is that we have inscriptional evidence, we have Romance languages, and languages in the world today that have phonemic vowel length tend to demonstrate pushing towards the periphery for the long variants and centralization of the short variants. Adams supports that without contention. But let's look at one of the most famous languages which has phonemic vowel length, Finnish. Does Finnish demonstrate this phenomenon? No. We have short E, long E, short U, long U, short U, long U, short E, long E, and so forth. It does not demonstrate that phenomenon. Well, okay, Finnish is just one of the languages in the world today that has phonemic vowel length. What about Hungarian? Well, actually, Hungarian does demonstrate this phenomenon. Well, we have E, and then the shorter E, long U, shorter U. We have the U and shorter U. Now, they're written as centralized, but after listening to quite a few samples of Hungarian, man, I cannot detect a difference. And that's probably because that they're both just really close up in the corner. So the languages that I know best, English and Italian, they're all basically in the same position. And in fact, it's not written as I. It's more or less in the position, but it's not I. It is I, and we have I, U, and U. Okay, so Hungarian kind of shows it, but not really. What about Japanese? No, not at all. It has short and long phonemic vowels, but it doesn't show any difference in quality. Serbo-Croatian has phonemic vowel length too, but it doesn't demonstrate this centralization phenomenon of the short variants. What about Czech? Well, it doesn't have it for the back vowels, but it does for the front. And it even has long e and short e, as Calabrese reconstructs for Latin. Well, until I looked closer, and I found that as for the high front vowel pair of long E, short E, there are dialectical differences with respect to phonetic realization of the contrast. In the Bohemian variety of Czech, the two vowels are differentiated by both quality and duration, while in East Moravian, the primary difference is that of duration. Okay, so even not all of Czech agrees with this. So this is the Bohemian variety. It isn't actually all of Czech. So no help really from the Czech language. Well, maybe we should leave Europe and try Arabic. Arabic has phonemic vowel length, right? Well, it absolutely does. But it only has 3 cardinal vowels, a, I, and u. And I'm aware that you can hear I and u in Arabic speakers. But as explained here, the short vowels can have a huge range of variation. And they're all possible allophones of u across different dialects. And also the short front vowels, I, they're all possible for the I vowel. This is why we see so many different spellings of Arabic names, because they can differ by dialect and whatever one hears. So the Arabic system, for example, is simply just less sensitive. The I and I is never a phonemic contrast, which is very interesting. So Arabic does not show us the model that Sidi Allen says is so common for languages with phonemic vowel length. Well, what about another Indo-European one, Sanskrit? Now, Sanskrit doesn't have a living phonology, but the short variant is reconstructed as I and not I. But that's an ancient language. A modern descendant of it is Hindustani, meaning Pakistani, and Hindi. Now, here is the first time we have seen a vowel space picture which even has I and U. It's for a language which has phonemic vowel length. It has A and E, it has O and O. Finally, a language that kind of starts to look like Allen's system, and it does have phonemic vowels. So I thought long and hard, okay, what other languages have phonemic vowel length? Oh, right, Irish, because there's the ones with the apices. Remember my Macron's apices video? I thought, all right, Irish has it. Ah, okay, now we're getting I and O. Now this is starting to really look like Allen's system. And this is the Connaught variant. Here is the Munster variant. We have I and O represented again, and here just one of these vowels for the letter A, for the A. This is starting to look a lot like it just has a schwa. If you got rid of the schwa, it would be Allen's system of Latin pronunciation. And then the Ulster one is like, oh, this is weirdly centralized. What's going on here? And then looking at the Wikipedia page, it goes into more detail, saying that the near closed vowels I and U show a similar pattern as what's going on here for the long ones. Basically, their qualities are all over the place, and that whatever quality they take is actually dependent on what kind of consonants are near them. So this system that Allen thinks is exactly what Latin has to do because it has phonemic vowel length, and Adams just accepts without really talking about it, I haven't found anything quite like it. I'm sure the 9 qualities can exist, no problem with that, and I'm sure you can find variants or dialects that do exactly, say of Arabic perhaps, that have exactly the qualities that Allen talks about. But it's not like it's the universal phenomenon. It's not even a common phenomenon from what I can tell. So Allen's argument is that we have inscriptional evidence. Well, all of it is junk before the imperial period, and the imperial inscriptions demonstrate only front vowel axis. So no to that. So to justify I and U, well, that doesn't work very well. His other argument of the Romance languages doesn't hold up at all. Completely thrown out. The last bit is that, well, you could still have classical Latin pronounced that way, and then you, for some reason, have the front vowels undergo that, even though there's already a weakening supposedly in the back, but that happened centuries later. Okay, I could even maybe say okay to that. It doesn't really have a place in pedagogy. It would just be something that you might like to do and maybe possibly could have existed. The only thing to justify it would be if this were actually a phenomenon in languages with phonemic vowel length, and it's not. It can happen, but it doesn't have to happen. And keeping in mind that going from I to I 3 times and U to U 4 times in half of Romance languages, just by counting the numbers of languages, we can even add another one, Aromanian, and we start to really dwarf the number of languages over in Western Romance. It becomes linguistically implausible. It's not the simplest explanation. So the last little thing I have here is just the phonology page on Wikipedia. Wikipedia is wonderful. Wikipedia can't be accurate about everything. Here, it simply summarizes what we saw in Vox Latina from Allen. Alan was an amazing philologist. He did great work. His Vox Latina was an important inspiration to me. And even though I had this gut instinct that the I and U were not right, I didn't really have the clear evidence until I saw Calabrese's paper and later the massive statistical evidence of Adams. So the problem that I have here is not that this system is presented, but I think the system needs to be presented in the same way as the land bridges between North America and Europe and South America and Africa to explain the similar dinosaurs and stuff on both sides of the Atlantic. This needs to be couched as this is a theory that's been prevalent for a long time, but it just can't hold up. At the very minimum, there should be something on this page to say that this is one suggestion. It has been so universally accepted because people just don't practice speaking Latin that much, and they get by in the classroom and they just kind of went this far and didn't go that much farther. Well, I don't accept that. If we want to actually use a classical Latin pronunciation, using I and U for the short vowels is demonstrably incorrect. And it doesn't mean people can't use it as a convention. Already that pronunciation has been diffused through Germany and the English-speaking world as the way to pronounce Latin for a long time for a lot of teachers. So if people are used to pronouncing, teaching, speaking in Latin, using that, I'm not saying they should stop. I'm saying that they should just know that the pronunciation they're using is not something that's from antiquity. It's a convention that was developed with absolutely the best of intentions. The evidence that we have does not support it. If you want to keep on using I and U, absolutely. If you're teaching Latin, learning Latin, speaking Latin, that's amazing. That's a wonderful and much more valuable thing. And like I said before, when it comes to pronunciation, if you're using phonemic vowel length, use ecclesiastical, use whatever pronunciation, use Allen's system, that's fine. But ultimately, the Calabrese vowel system is much more accurate for classical Latin. Now you know why I pronounce Latin the way I do, and why a lot of other people who've had the chance to read some of this in this kind of detail have been as persuaded as I have been. As always, I welcome discussion on this. There can always be new discoveries in evidence and new analyses of linguistics that overturn this theory. Maybe we'll blow off a little bit more space dust from this book and find out that there's another layer. But for now, the only tenable solution to me is that I and U have no place in the pronunciation of Latin in antiquity, that we shouldn't teach it as the reconstructed pronunciation, that it can be a variant that people use for convention because it suits their English or German ears, no problem. But indeed, the pronunciation of the 10 native Latin vowels is I, e, a, o, u. Thanks so much for watching, sharing, liking, and subscribing. Valete.